Let's continue with how the Bible was built, looking at the Old Testament, the first part, and the cornerstone of the Bible. What is the cornerstone of the Bible? Well, as we look at how the Bible came together, as we would the construction of a house, it is essential to have a solid foundation. The first part of our house of the Bible is the most often referred to as the Old Testament. To one who follows the Hebrew scripture, they would refer to it as the Tanakh. The family of faith called the Jews came to the land we know as current-day Palestine, biblical days Canaan, or the Promised Land, about 1,800 years before the birth of Jesus. So, what is the cornerstone of the Bible? The cornerstone of the house of the Bible wasn't laid in place, though, until the 7th century BC, well into Jewish history. And here's the fascinating story of what happened. The Jewish people had become divided into two nations. The northern nation, or the northern kingdom, which was Israel. The southern nation, or the southern kingdom, which was called Judah. And the northern kingdom, Solomon reigned over Israel for 40 years. Then Rehoboam, who was a son and the successor to Solomon, and a grandson to King David, became king. At this time, the northern tribes had grown weary of Solomon's oppressive forced labor. The Israelites, the Jews, asked Rehoboam to lighten their burden. But rather than following the wise counsel of the elders who served under Solomon, Rehoboam listened to his younger peers and pledged to intensify the burden of labor. This prompted the Jews and the 10 northern tribes to split. So then, from 931 to 722 BC, there were two kingdoms. And in 722 BC, Assyria conquered the northern kingdom, Israel. From 722 to 586, there was only the southern kingdom. So what about the southern kingdom? What happened to the southern kingdom of Judah? Well, Judah had been ruled for more than 50 years by a king named Manasseh. And from the point of view of the Jewish religion, Manasseh was an unacceptable king. He promoted the worship of many gods, and during his reign, every community had its own god to worship. This community owned God, that community, this community, everyone had their own God to worship. The worship of Yahweh God pretty much faded away. When Manasseh died, a young king named Josiah became king. King Josiah had the people rebuild, repair the temple of God. And in the process, a priest of the temple discovered the book that we now call Deuteronomy, hidden away in some dark corner. It was written in the time of King Manasseh, that evil king. The person who wrote this book, this letter, had to do it in hiding, hoping that someone would find it in brighter days. King Josiah welcomed the newly discovered book and made it the program for his reformation. It became the law of the land. The nation of Judah was a theocracy, that is to say, a country in which the civil law and the religious law were one and the same. By making the religious writing the law of the land, Josiah gave it special status in the eyes of the people. And when you give a religious writing special status, you have taken the first step of the creation of Holy Scripture. So what was so special about the book of Deuteronomy? Well, no writing will long continue to be held in high esteem by the people, even if the king dictates it, unless they find it worthy and helpful in its own right. Deuteronomy appealed to the people because it contains two great elements of Yahweh God: the priestly element and the prophetic element. The priestly element. When people have strong religious convictions, they put these beliefs and attitudes into rituals and ceremonies. By participating in these ceremonies, they dramatize and affirm their belief. These rituals help keep a religion alive. For example, if believers didn't go to church nowadays, it'd be easy for our faith to fade away, because it's so important for us to gather as a fellowship of believers. But the religion of the Jews had its ceremonies, its rituals, and these too are described in the book of Deuteronomy. This is the priestly element. There's also a prophetic element. The prophetic element is the religion of the Jews had a concern for how people should behave, ought to behave themselves. It had well-defined ideas about how individuals should treat one another, what is just, what is right, and what God demands of us day in and day out. This is the moral or ethical aspect of religious faith. How God expected people to behave is the prophetic element of Israel's religion described in the book of Deuteronomy. We can say the book of Deuteronomy taught the followers of Yahweh to be reverent and how to be good. That's why the people found it so useful. That's why it became the cornerstone of the Old Testament. Deuteronomy is not the oldest piece of writing in the Old Testament, but it was the first to be looked at as Holy Scripture. However, it takes more than a cornerstone to form a foundation. In the 200 years following the discoveries of the book of Deuteronomy, several other books were discovered which were recognized by the people of great importance to their faith and life. We know these books as Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and the book of Deuteronomy. And then we have the Old Testament law, or the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And the Torah, or the Pentateuch, became holy scripture for the Jews. So returning to our metaphor, Deuteronomy is the cornerstone of the law of the Old Testament. And it's the law is the foundation of the Old Testament wing of the house of the Bible. So you have the Old Testament as the foundation of the, or you have Deuteronomy and the law is the old foundation of the Old Testament, and Deuteronomy the cornerstone. Well, in the next video, we're going to look at the second part of the Old Testament, the walls and the roof. And I encourage you to continue watching as we talk about the second part of the Old Testament and learn more about the books that we consider the walls and the roof of this house.